The crystal glasses clinked against fine china as Pamela raised her flute of champagne, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light from the chandelier above us. "To David," she announced, her voice carrying across the sprawling dining table, "who has proven that Mitchell men always find success no matter what, or who tries to hold them back." Her gaze locked with mine as the room fell silent. The underlying accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I sat frozen, feeling the heat of 20 pairs of eyes burning into me. My husband David shifted, uncomfortably beside me, but said nothing. "A toast to success," Pamela continued, "and to those smart enough to recognize it when they see it." Several family members exchanged knowing glances and smirked. Michael's wife Jennifer whispered something to him, and he nodded with a small laugh. That's when I felt a small hand grip mine under the table. Sophie, my 12-year-old daughter, squeezed my fingers so tightly it almost hurt. Her eyes, so much like her father's, were filled with a fierce determination I'd never seen before. Before I could stop her, she slipped her other hand into her dress pocket and pulled out her phone. "Actually, Grandma," Sophie said, her voice clear and unwavering despite her age, "I think you should hear something before we toast. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Mitchell, though everyone has always called me Becca. At 36, I'm not who I expected to be at this point in my life. But then again, life rarely follows the paths we imagine for ourselves. 10 years ago, I was Becca Taylor, marketing director at Next Gen Software, with my own corner office overlooking the Philadelphia skyline. I wore power suits, led a team of 12, and had just been named one of the city's 30 under 30 business leaders to watch. I lived in a sleek downtown apartment, dated casually but carefully, and had a 5-year plan that didn't include marriage or children. That all changed the day David Mitchell walked into my office for his job interview. David wasn't like the other applicants. While they arrived with polished portfolios and rehearsed answers, he showed up with genuine innovation and quiet confidence. He didn't try to impress me. He just shared his vision for software that could revolutionize how small businesses managed customer relationships. His eyes lit up when he talked about his code, about the possibilities he saw that others had missed. I hired him on the spot, against the HR director's recommendation. Within 6 months, David's project had become the company's most promising development. We spent late nights in the office, ordering takeout and debugging his program, building something we both believed in. I fought for his project in executive meetings, secured additional funding, and positioned his software as our next flagship product. Somewhere between coffee-fueled coding sessions and strategy meetings, we fell in love. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was as natural as breathing. One night, after everyone else had gone home, he looked up from his computer and said, "You know, you're the only person who ever really believed in me." Then he kissed me, and everything changed. We kept our relationship secret at work for 6 months before I transferred him to another division to avoid any conflict of interest. By then, his software was already in beta testing with select clients, showing incredible promise. When he proposed a year later, I said yes without hesitation. The first time I met the Mitchell family was at a dinner at Pamela and Richard's sprawling colonial home in the prestigious Chestnut Hill neighborhood. The house had been in the family for 3 generations, with gleaming hardwood floors and oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors. I wore my best dress and brought an expensive bottle of wine, eager to make a good impression. I should have known something was off when Pamela took the wine with a thin smile and said, "How thoughtful. We'll save this for cooking." Then she served a French vintage that cost more than my monthly car payment. Throughout dinner, they asked pointed questions about my family background: middle class, father a high school teacher, mother a nurse, my education, State University on scholarship, not Ivy League like all the Mitchells, and my little marketing job, as Pamela called it. David squeezed my hand under the table and later assured me they were just getting to know me. When we announced our engagement 2 months later at another family dinner, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Pamela's face went rigid with a forced smile. Richard cleared his throat and mumbled congratulations while studying his plate. Michael asked bluntly if we'd signed a prenup. Only Amanda, David's younger sister, seemed genuinely happy for us, rushing around the table to hug me. "Don't mind them," Amanda whispered as she embraced me. "They're just protective of the family legacy. They'll warm up once they know you better." But they never did. The wedding was lavish. Pamela insisted on it, not for my benefit, but because Mitchells have standards to maintain. I wanted something smaller, more intimate, but found myself swept along in a tide of extravagant plans. David wanted to keep the peace, so I compromised. 200 guests, most of whom I'd never met, watched us exchange vows at the historic society venue that had hosted Mitchell weddings for decades. At the reception, I overheard Pamela telling her friends, "She certainly landed on her feet, didn't she? From a tiny apartment to Chestnut Hill in one, I do." They didn't realize I was just around the corner, checking my makeup. I said nothing to David. It was our wedding day, and I didn't want anything to spoil it. After we married, David wanted to leave NextGen and develop his software independently. The company had started making changes to his program that he felt compromised its integrity. I believed in his vision enough to take a risk. I used my connections to help him secure startup funding, introduced him to potential investors, and put in countless unpaid hours helping him refine his business plan. When Sophie came along unexpectedly a year into our marriage, we were overjoyed but financially stretched. I took a 6-month maternity leave, during which David's company began to take off. By the time I was ready to return to work, Sophie was showing signs of what we would later learn were mild learning differences. She needed more attention, more structure, more consistency than a standard daycare could provide. Meanwhile, David was working 16-hour days to get his company off the ground. We made a joint decision. I would step back from my career temporarily to support both Sophie and David's growing business. I continued consulting for David's company from home, managing marketing strategies and client relationships while caring for our daughter. It was supposed to be for a year, maybe 2. Those 2 years stretched into 5 as David's software became wildly successful. I remained involved behind the scenes, but my name wasn't on the company letterhead. When Sophie started school, I took a part-time position as an event planner, giving me the flexibility to be available for her needs while keeping my professional skills sharp. I was proud of what David had accomplished, what we had accomplished together, and I was fulfilling as a mother. I had found a balance that worked for our family. The Mitchells saw it differently. "Such a shame you gave up your career," Pamela would say during family gatherings, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But I suppose some women just aren't cut out for the business world's demands. David's doing well enough for both of you know," Richard would add with a knowing smile. At Sophie's 7th birthday party, I overheard Michael telling another guest, "She had him transferred out of her department at work, you know. She could spot a meal ticket from a mile away." Each comment stung, but I brushed them off. David and I knew the truth of our partnership, or at least I thought we did. As David's company grew, so did the demands on his time. Board meetings, investor pitches, international conferences. He was constantly busy, increasingly distant. When he was home, he was distracted, checking emails on his phone during dinner, taking calls during Sophie's violin recitals. The Mitchell family events became more frequent and more extravagant as their golden son's success multiplied. I attended these gatherings with a practiced smile, weathering the subtle jabs and pointed questions about when I would finally get a real job again. Sophie noticed everything. Her quiet intelligence missed nothing, not the way her grandmother's smile never reached her eyes when greeting me, Not the way her father's attention had shifted away from our family, not the changes in our home dynamic. She started sitting closer to me at family events, reaching for my hand when the conversation turned uncomfortable. 3 weeks ago, everything came to a head at the annual Mitchell family retreat at their lake house in the Poconos. This year was special. It marked the 10th anniversary of David's company and coincided with Pamela and Richard's 40th wedding anniversary. Everyone was expected to attend the full week of celebration. The lakeside property was stunning. 6 bedrooms, a boat dock, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. It had been in the family for generations, a symbol of the Mitchell success story. David and I were assigned the smallest guest room, while Michael and Jennifer took the spacious Lakeview suite. It was a small slight, but a familiar one. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first few days were tense but manageable. I helped prepare meals, organized activities for the cousins, and tried to find moments of genuine connection with David's family. Sophie stuck close to me, watching the adults with those observant eyes. On the third night, we had a formal dinner to celebrate Pamela and Richard's anniversary. Everyone dressed up, and Richard brought out bottles of champagne that he'd been saving for the occasion. The conversation flowed along with the alcohol, becoming looser, less guarded as the evening progressed. That's when Pamela stood to make her toast, glass raised high, diamonds glittering on her wrist. To Richard, my rock for 40 incredible years, she began. To our children, who have made us so proud. Especially to David, who has taken the Mitchell name to new heights with his brilliance. She paused, looking directly at me before continuing. We always knew you were destined for greatness, darling, even when others might have slowed you down or taken credit for your genius. The implication was clear. A decade of snide comments and whispered insults had finally been laid bare, for everyone to hear. I felt the blood drain from my face as several family members nodded in agreement. To success, Pamela concluded, and to recognizing where it truly comes from. David shifted in his seat beside me but said nothing. After 10 years of marriage, after everything we'd built together, his silence cut deeper than his mother's words. I placed my napkin on the table, ready to excuse myself before the tears threatening behind my eyes could fall. That's when Sophie, my quiet, watchful daughter, spoke up. Actually, Grandma, she said, her voice steady despite her age, I think you should hear something before we toast. The table fell silent as Sophie pulled out her phone. With surprising composure, she tapped the screen a few times, then placed it in the center of the table. I was working on a family history project for school, she explained, her eyes moving from face to face around the table. Dad gave me some old files to look through. I found this in a folder of recordings from when he was starting the company. She pressed play, and David's voice filled the dining room. I couldn't have done this without you, Becca, his younger self said clearly. This isn't just my company, it's ours. Your marketing strategy made all the difference with the investors. Without your contacts, your business plan revisions, your belief in me, this would still just be lines of code on my laptop. My heart stopped. I remembered that conversation. It was from the night we received our first major investment commitment. We'd celebrated in his tiny office, exhausted but elated, dreaming of the future we would build together. You're the backbone of this operation, recording David continued. When we make this official, your name is going on those documents with mine. Equal partners, just like we are in everything else. The recording ended, leaving a silence so complete you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. Sophie reached over and took my hand, squeezing it tightly. Her expression was calm but resolute. Dad tells me all the time that Mom is the reason his company worked, she said into the silence. He says she believed in him when nobody else did, and that she's still the smartest business person he knows. I couldn't look at David. I couldn't look at anyone. Tears blurred my vision as a decade of suppressed hurt and frustration welled up inside me. "Sophie, honey," Pamela began, her voice strained with forced gentleness. "Business conversations can be very complex. I'm sure your father was just being kind." "I have 7 more recordings," Sophie interrupted, her thumb hovering over her phone screen. "Should I play the one where Dad says Mom gave up her career to support him? Or maybe the one where he tells his friend that she hasn't gotten the recognition she deserves?" I finally turned to look at David. His face had drained of color, but there was something else in his expression, a strange mixture of shame and relief, as though a weight he'd been carrying had suddenly been exposed. "She's right," he said quietly, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Everything Sophie said is true. Becca wasn't just supportive, she was instrumental. Her marketing expertise, her business connections, her strategies. Without her, there would be no Mitchell Software." He turned to face me directly, and I've never properly acknowledged that. Not to my family, not publicly, and worst of all, not to you. Not for years. The dining room erupted into chaotic conversation. Pamela was shaking her head vehemently. Michael looked skeptical, while Jennifer appeared genuinely shocked. Amanda was nodding as though she'd suspected this all along. Richard simply stared at his son, his expression unreadable. I couldn't process it all. After years of subtle degradation, of being treated like a gold digger who had latched onto David's success, the truth was finally out in the open, revealed not by me or even by David, but by our 12-year-old daughter who had been quietly observing it all. "I think I need some air," I said, standing up on shaky legs. I walked out onto the deck overlooking the lake, the cool evening breeze a blessed relief against my flushed skin. Behind me, I could hear the continued commotion from the dining room, Pamela's protests, David's increasingly firm responses, Sophie's clear voice cutting through it all. I gripped the railing and took deep breaths, trying to steady myself. The moon cast a silver path across the dark water, and I focused on its light, an island of calm in the turbulence of the evening. I didn't hear the deck door open, but suddenly Sophie was beside me, slipping her small hand into mine. She didn't speak, just leaned her head against my arm. A moment later, David joined us, standing on my other side. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I'm so sorry, Becca." The 3 of us stood in silence, a family unit separate from the chaos inside. Eventually, David spoke again. "Tomorrow, I'm calling a board meeting. I'm going to propose adding you as co-founder with backdated recognition. It's years overdue." I turned to look at him, searching his face for signs of insincerity or obligation. I found none, only regret and resolve. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I asked. "When your family would make those comments, when they treated me like I was nothing but a gold digger." David's shoulders slumped. "At first, I thought they just needed time to see who you really are. Then, as the company grew, it became easier to accept their version of the story. The successful son who did it all himself. It fed my ego, and I'm ashamed of that." He paused. The more time passed, the harder it became to correct the narrative. Sophie squeezed my hand. "I didn't mean to make everyone upset, Mom. But it wasn't fair. You always tell me to stand up for what's right." I pulled her into a hug, tears flowing freely now. "You did exactly right, sweetheart. You stood up for the truth." The deck door opened again, and we turned to see Amanda standing hesitantly at the threshold. "Can I join you?" she asked softly. I nodded, and she came to stand beside us at the railing. "I always suspected," she said, "the way David talked about you in the early days, before the success. It was obvious you were partners in every sense." She touched my arm gently. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry I never said anything either." Over the next hour, various family members made their way onto the deck. Richard came out, looking older than he had at dinner, and awkwardly patted my shoulder before engaging David in a quiet conversation by the steps. Michael appeared briefly, avoiding my eyes but nodding curtly in what might have been an acknowledgement. Jennifer brought out glasses of water, her usual polished confidence notably dimmed. Pamela didn't come out at all. The next morning, we packed our bags and left the lake house 3 days early. No dramatic confrontations, no tearful apologies, just a quiet departure as the sun rose over the water. David called his board members from the car, scheduling an emergency meeting for the following day. Sophie dozed in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional night. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, everything has changed, and nothing has. David made good on his promise. The board approved my retroactive recognition as co-founder, with appropriate financial adjustments. A press release went out announcing the clarification of the company's founding story, professionally worded but clear in its message. My phone hasn't stopped ringing with calls from former colleagues and business contacts, some congratulatory, others awkwardly explaining that they always knew but didn't want to get involved. We haven't heard from Pamela or Richard, though. Amanda calls every few days. Michael sent a stiff email acknowledging the new information and suggesting we all move forward professionally. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. At home, David and I are talking more honestly than we have in years. There's hurt to work through, trust to rebuild, but also a foundation of love and shared purpose that never fully disappeared. We're seeing a marriage counselor, learning to communicate again. The most profound change has been in my relationship with Sophie. My quiet, observant daughter had seen everything: my hurt, my contributions, the family dynamics. And when the moment came, she found her voice. She stood up not just for me, but for truth itself. Last night, I found her working on something at the kitchen table, colored markers spread out around her. "What are you making?" I asked, peering over her shoulder. She held up a hand-drawn family tree. Unlike the traditional version, this one didn't just have names and dates. It had small notes about each person's contributions. Beside my name, she had written, "Co-founder of Mitchell Software, marketing genius, best mom ever." "It's for my school project," she explained. "The teacher said we should include what family members have accomplished." I wrapped my arms around her, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. "I'm so proud of you," I whispered into her hair. She looked up at me with those wise eyes. "I'm proud of you too, Mom. You weren't just Dad's cheerleader, you were his teammate." Sometimes the truth doesn't need a grand revelation or public vindication. Sometimes it just needs to be spoken aloud after years of silence. And sometimes, the person brave enough to speak it isn't who you'd expect. I don't know what the future holds for our relationship with the Mitchell family. Wounds that deep don't heal overnight, if they ever truly heal at all. But I do know this: I won't be silent anymore. I won't let anyone, family or otherwise, diminish what I've contributed or who I am. And I have my 12-year-old daughter to thank for teaching me that lesson. If you've ever had your contributions minimized or your truth silenced, know that you're not alone. Sometimes it takes years for justice to come, and sometimes it arrives in the most unexpected ways. If this story resonated with you, please share your experiences in the comments below. Let's create a community where everyone's contributions are recognized and valued. And don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is something I've been working on for months, and I can't wait to share it with you all. Until then, remember, your truth matters, even when others try to rewrite it. The dining room fell completely silent as Sophie pressed play on her phone. The recording was crystal clear despite being years old. David's voice echoed through the room, younger but unmistakable, filled with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard in years. "I couldn't have done this without you, Becca. This isn't just my company, it's ours. Your marketing strategy made all the difference with the investors. without your contacts, your business plan revisions, your belief in me. This would still just be lines of code on my laptop. I remembered that night vividly. We'd been working for months to secure funding, refining his pitch deck until 3 a.m. most nights. I'd called in favors from former clients, arranged meetings with investors who wouldn't normally give a startup the time of day. When David's pitch landed, when we got that first commitment of serious capital, we'd opened a bottle of champagne in his tiny rented office space. The same champagne we were drinking now, actually. Pamela always served the same brand at family celebrations. David's recorded voice continued, "You're the backbone of this operation. When we make this official, your name is going on those documents with mine. Equal partners, just like we are in everything else." Sophie stopped the recording and looked around the table, her chin raised slightly. At 12 years old, she somehow managed to command the room with more authority than I'd ever mustered in this house. "I have more," she said simply. "Lots more." Pamela's face had transformed from smug satisfaction to barely controlled fury. Her fingers gripped her champagne flute so tightly I was surprised it didn't shatter. Richard stared at his plate, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Michael and Jennifer exchanged glances that betrayed their discomfort. "That was a private conversation," David finally said, his voice strained. "Yes," Sophie agreed. "A private conversation where you told the truth. Unlike what happens at these family dinners." I placed my hand on Sophie's arm, not to silence her, but to support her. I was in shock. Not at the content of the recording. I remembered David's promises and passion from those early days, but at my daughter's courage and her awareness of what had been happening in this family for years. "Sophie, sweetheart," Pamela began, her voice honeyed in that particular way that always preceded something cutting. "I'm sure your father was just being kind to your mother. In business, sometimes we say things to what, Grandma?" Sophie interrupted. "To lie? Dad wasn't lying then. He's been lying now. Or at least, not telling the whole truth." David pushed his chair back from the table slightly. "She's right," he said quietly, then more firmly. "Sophie is right." All eyes turned to him. In 10 years of marriage, through countless dinners, where his family had subtly and not so subtly belittled me, I had never heard David directly contradict his mother. "Becca was my boss at NextGen," he continued. "She saw potential in my software when everyone else dismissed it. She fought for resources, mentored me, helped me develop not just the product, but the entire business model." He looked at me directly, for what felt like the first time in years. "When we decided to launch the company independently, Becca was the one who knew how to make it happen. She wrote our business plan, prepared our investor pitches, leveraged her professional network, the same network she'd spent years building while I was still finishing college." The room remained silent as David continued. "She stepped back from her career to support mine when Sophie was born. She's worked behind the scenes for this company from day one. Every major client relationship, every marketing strategy, every crisis management plan, Becca's fingerprints are all over them." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These were things I'd told myself in quiet moments of frustration, things I'd occasionally mentioned to David during rare arguments about his family's treatment of me. But I had never expected to hear him acknowledge them publicly, especially not in front of his mother. "That's absurd," Pamela finally sputtered. "If she was so instrumental, why isn't her name on the company? Why isn't she on the board? Why? Haven't we ever heard about any of this before?" David flinched at these questions, and I knew why. They were the same questions I had asked him years ago, when the company started to take off, when magazine profiles described him as a self-made tech genius with no mention of our partnership. "Because I didn't insist on it," I said, finding my voice at last. "Because I believed David when he said we were in this together, that the company's success was our success. that formal recognition didn't matter as much as our partnership. I paused, looking around the table. And because I never imagined that lack of formal recognition would be used to paint me as some kind of gold digger who contributed nothing and just got lucky. Pamela's face flushed red. Now wait just a minute. No, Mom, David interrupted. Becca's right. I've let this narrative continue for too long. I've enjoyed the accolades without correcting the record. I rationalized it by telling myself it was simpler this way, that Becca understood, that it didn't matter what other people thought as long as we knew the truth. He reached for my hand across the table. But the truth is, I liked being seen as the sole genius behind Mitchell Software. I liked the articles and the speaking engagements and the business awards, and I convinced myself that because I financially provided for our family, that was enough, that Becca's contributions could remain private. Sophie had been quietly observing this exchange, her eyes moving from face to face. Now she spoke up again. The company is called Mitchell Software. We're all Mitchells. Mom is a Mitchell too. The simple logic of a 12-year-old cut through the tension in the room. Yes, I was a Mitchell, at least in name. But I had never truly been accepted as part of this family, never been seen as worthy of the precious Mitchell legacy. Amanda, David's younger sister who had always been kindest to me, cleared her throat. David, is this really true? Becca was a key part of starting the company? David nodded. Without Becca, there would be no Mitchell Software. Period. Amanda turned to her mother. So all these years when you've been making those comments about Becca marrying into money, about her giving up her career because she couldn't hack it, about her being lucky to have caught David, you've had it completely backwards? The directness of Amanda's question made me realize she had been aware of Pamela's behavior all along. She had noticed the subtle put-downs, the backhanded compliments, the revisionist history. She just hadn't spoken up before now. I never said, Pamela began defensively. You said it last Christmas, Amanda interrupted. When Becca mentioned, she was thinking of going back to full-time work, you said, and I quote, "Oh, darling, why bother? You've already secured your meal ticket." You said it, Mom. We all heard it. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Pamela, perhaps we should— No, Pamela said sharply. I will not be made to feel like the villain here. If Becca had these concerns, she should have raised them years ago. Coming out with all this now, making these claims about her involvement in the company after it's already successful. I have the documents, David said quietly. All the original business plans in Becca's handwriting. Emails from investors saying they were impressed with her presentation. Early contracts she drafted. Strategy documents she created. He looked at Sophie's phone, still sitting in the center of the table. And apparently, I have recordings of myself acknowledging all of this at the time. Michael, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. Why are we even discussing this at Mom and Dad's anniversary dinner? This is hardly the time or place. I felt a flash of anger at his attempt to sweep everything under the rug. When would be the appropriate time, Michael? After another decade of being treated like I contributed nothing? After Sophie grows up believing her mother is nothing but a hanger-on who got lucky? That's not what I'm saying, Michael backpedaled. I think, Sophie interjected with the confidence only a child could maintain in this situation, that we should listen to the other recordings. I have one from 3 months ago, where Dad told his friend Steve that Mom's marketing campaign saved the company during the pandemic. David looked startled. You have that? Sophie, have you been recording my phone calls? Sophie shook her head. No, Dad. Remember when you let me use your cloud account for my school project? All your voice memos sync there automatically. I was looking for your recording of Grandpa's World War II stories, but I found these instead. The innocence with which she described stumbling upon such explosive material almost made me laugh despite the tension. Of course it would be something like this, a technology oversight, that finally brought everything to light. I think we've heard quite enough, Pamela said stiffly, rising from her chair. This dinner is over. We can discuss this another time, when emotions aren't running so high. Sit down, Pamela, Richard said suddenly, his voice firm. Everyone at the table froze. Richard almost never contradicted his wife. We're going to deal with this now, he continued, because it's been ignored for far too long. He turned to me, his expression serious but not unkind. Becca, I owe you an apology. I've sat by while assumptions were made about your character and your contributions. I should have asked questions a long time ago. Pamela slowly lowered herself back into her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. Richard's unexpected support had clearly thrown her off balance. Thank you, Richard, I said quietly. That means a lot. Richard then turned to his son. David, you need to make this right, not just here at this table, but professionally. If what you're saying is true, Becca deserves formal recognition for her role in building the company. David nodded. I know. I've been thinking about it for a while, actually. Things have just been so complicated with the new venture capital round and the potential acquisition talks. Those aren't excuses, Richard said firmly. They're just more reasons why proper credit and compensation are overdue. I glanced at Richard with newfound respect. Perhaps I had misjudged him all these years, mistaking his quietness for agreement with Pamela's attitude toward me. Sophie looked around the table, a small smile playing at her lips. So, are we going to finish Grandma and Grandpa's anniversary dinner? I'm still hungry, and we haven't even had cake yet. Her attempt to restore normalcy broke the tension slightly. Jennifer, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, stood up. I'll go check on dessert, she offered, clearly grateful for an excuse to leave the room. As Jennifer disappeared into the kitchen, an awkward silence descended on the dining room. The grand anniversary celebration had transformed into something entirely different, a reckoning that was long overdue. David reached for my hand across the table. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have done this years ago. I squeezed his hand, but didn't respond. 10 years of frustration and hurt couldn't be erased with one apology, no matter how sincere. We would need to have many more conversations in private, away from his family's eyes and ears. Jennifer returned with the anniversary cake, a lavish 3-tiered creation topped with a 40 in gold numerals. The absurdity of continuing with the celebration wasn't lost on anyone, but we all went through the motions. Richard and Pamela stood together behind the cake for photos, their smiles strained. Pamela's eyes were flat and hard. Richard's held a new thoughtfulness I'd never seen before. After dessert was served, I excused myself to use the restroom, needing a moment alone to process everything that had happened. As I walked down the hallway, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Amanda following me. Becca, wait, she called softly. She caught up to me near the powder room. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I knew how Mom treated you, and I never really spoke up. I nodded, accepting her apology. It's a difficult position to be in. Standing up to your family isn't easy. Tell that to your daughter, Amanda said with a small laugh. She's got more backbone than all of us put together. I couldn't help but smile. She surprises me every day. Amanda's expression grew serious again. I want you to know that I always suspected there was more to the story of Mitchell Software. David used to talk about you with such respect and admiration before you were even dating. The way he described your business instincts, your strategic thinking. It never made sense to me that you would just step aside completely when the company took off. It wasn't supposed to be stepping aside, I explained. It was supposed to be supporting from behind the scenes while taking care of Sophie. But somewhere along the way, supporting became erasing. Amanda nodded. For what it's worth, I think Mom's attitude comes from her own history. She gave up a promising career in interior design when she married Dad. I think she resents that choice, even though she made it willingly. Seeing you initially succeed in your career and then seemingly give it up. I think it triggered something in her. That doesn't excuse how she's treated me, I said firmly. No, it doesn't, Amanda agreed. Nothing excuses that. I just thought you should know there might be more behind it than simple snobbery or meanness. I appreciated Amanda's insight, even if it didn't change the years of subtle degradation I'd experienced. Understanding Pamela's possible motivations didn't heal the wounds, but it helped me see her as a more complex person, rather than simply an antagonist in my life story. When we returned to the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted again. Michael and Jennifer were engaged in intense, whispered conversation. Pamela was dabbing at her eyes with a napkin while Richard patted her hand awkwardly. Sophie was showing David something on her phone, both of their heads bent together over the screen. "Everything okay?" I asked as I slid back into my seat beside David. He looked up, his expression a mixture of guilt and determination. "I just sent an email to the board requesting an emergency meeting tomorrow. I've asked them to recognize you retroactively as co-founder with appropriate equity adjustment." I stared at him, stunned by the swiftness of his action. "David, you didn't have to do that right this minute, in the middle of dinner." "Yes, I did," he interrupted. "I've put this off for years, making excuses about timing and optics and complications. No more delays." Across the table, Pamela sniffed loudly. "I hope you've considered the legal implications of such a dramatic company restructuring, David. The shareholders might have questions." "The shareholders will understand when I explain that I'm simply correcting a long-standing oversight," David replied, his tone firm. "The company's success speaks for itself, regardless of who gets the credit. And Becca deserves her share of that credit." I felt a wave of emotions: vindication, relief, lingering hurt, and a new uncertainty about what this would mean for our future. Part of me wanted to tell David it wasn't necessary, that we could discuss it later in private, that the public acknowledgement wasn't what mattered most. But another part, the part that had swallowed my contributions and my pride for too long, stayed silent. It was time for the truth to be recognized. Later that night, after we had retired to our guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed while David paced back and forth, still processing everything that had happened. "I can't believe Sophie had those recordings," he said for the third time, "and that she understood what they meant." "She's always been observant," I replied. "She notices everything, and lately, she's been asking more questions about my career before she was born. I think she's been putting the pieces together for a while." David stopped pacing and sat beside me. "I've really messed up, haven't I? Not just with the company stuff, but with us. I've let my family disrespect you for years." I didn't rush to reassure him. This moment of clarity had been too long, in coming for me to soften its impact. "Yes, you have," I said simply. "Every time your mother made one of her comments and you said nothing, it hurt. Every time your achievements were celebrated while my contributions were forgotten, it hurt. Every magazine profile that painted you as a solo genius while I was just the supportive wife at home, it hurt." David winced but nodded. "I know. I justified it by telling myself that we knew the truth, that the public story didn't matter as long as we were a team behind closed doors. But that wasn't enough, was it?" "No," I said. "Because the story we tell the world shapes how the world treats us. And your family's story about me, the gold digger who caught a rising star, has shaped how they've treated me for a decade. I'm going to make it right," David promised, taking my hands in his. "The board meeting tomorrow is just the beginning. We'll correct the public narrative, too." I looked into his eyes, searching for the man I had fallen in love with years ago, the passionate, honest developer who had valued my business acumen as much as my heart. He was still in there, beneath layers of success and family expectation and compromise. It's not just about the company, David. It's about us. Somewhere along the way, we stopped being partners and started being, employer and employee, star and supporting cast. I don't want that kind of marriage. Neither do I, he said fervently. I want us back the way we were, making decisions together, respecting each other's strengths, equal partners in everything. I almost smiled at his choice of words, the same phrase he had used in the recording Sophie had played. It won't be easy. There's a lot of water under the bridge. I know, he acknowledged. But we can start by being honest, with my family, with the world, and most importantly, with each other. A soft knock at the door interrupted our conversation. When David opened it, Sophie stood in the hallway in her pajamas, looking smaller and younger than she had at dinner. "Can I come in?" she asked hesitantly. "I can't sleep." I opened my arms and she rushed into them, burying her face against my shoulder. "I'm sorry if I made things worse, Mom," she mumbled against my sweater. "You didn't make things worse, sweetheart," I assured her, stroking her hair. "You made things honest. That's never wrong." David sat beside us, wrapping an arm around both of us. "How long have you known about all this, Sophie? About Mom's role in the company?" Sophie looked up, her expression thoughtful. "I think I've always known pieces of it. The way you talk about business stuff with Mom, not just normal husband-wife things. The way you ask her opinion on big decisions. And then I found your old recordings, and it all made sense. Why didn't you say something sooner?" I asked gently. She shrugged. "I wasn't sure if it was a secret or just something nobody talked about. And," she hesitated, "I didn't want to make Grandma mad. She's scary when she's mad." Despite everything, I laughed. "Yes, she certainly can be. But tonight, when she said that thing about you holding Dad back," Sophie continued, her young face suddenly fierce, "I couldn't let her get away with it, not when I knew the truth." I hugged her tightly, overwhelmed with pride and love for this remarkable person we had raised. In so many ways, she was braver than both her parents combined. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," David said with a sigh. "Mom won't let this go easily." "I know," I acknowledged. "This isn't over by a long shot." And it wasn't. The confrontation at dinner was just the beginning of what would become a seismic shift in our family dynamics, our marriage, and my professional identity. After years of silence and compliance, there was no going back to the way things had been. The truth, once spoken aloud, had taken on a life of its own. But whatever came next, we would face it together, as a family, as partners. And I would never again allow my story to be written by someone else, no matter how intimidating they might be. Sophie had taught me that. My 12-year-old daughter, armed with nothing but the truth and the courage to speak it, had changed everything. As she drifted off to sleep between us on the hotel bed, I made a silent promise, to her, to myself, and to the woman I used to be, the marketing director with big dreams who had believed in a promising young developer. I would reclaim my voice, my contributions, and my place in our shared story. It was long overdue. The morning after the dinner confrontation dawned crisp and clear, the sunlight streaming through the lake house windows at odds with the heaviness I felt. We had barely slept, David and I talking late into the night, while Sophie curled between us, eventually drifting off while we continued to whisper over her head about what would come next. I sat on the deck with a cup of coffee, watching the mist rise off the water. The lake was beautiful at this hour, peaceful in a way that made the previous night's chaos seem almost dreamlike. Almost, but not quite. The reality of what had happened, of what Sophie had revealed, hung in the air as tangibly as the morning mist. The sliding door opened behind me, and I tensed, expecting David or Sophie. Instead, Richard stepped onto the deck, his own coffee mug in hand. "May I join you?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual authoritative edge. I nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. Richard had always been an enigma to me, neither openly hostile like Pamela, nor particularly warm. He'd always struck me as a man who preferred to observe rather than participate in family drama, stepping in only when absolutely necessary. Last night had been one of those rare moments when he'd asserted himself. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching a pair of loons glide across the water. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology, Becca," he said, staring into his coffee rather than at me. "Not just for last night, but for 10 years of failing to see what was happening." I turned to study his profile. In the early morning light, he looked older than his 68 years, the lines around his eyes and mouth more pronounced. "I'm listening," I said simply. Richard took a deep breath. "When David brought you home that first time, Pamela was concerned. She had certain expectations about the kind of woman our son would marry. Someone from a similar background, someone who understood our family traditions. Someone with the right pedigree," I supplied, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Richard nodded, acknowledging the accuracy of my assessment. Yes, though I wouldn't have put it quite that way. But then, when David started his company, when it began to succeed beyond anything we could have imagined, well, Pamela became convinced that you had recognized his potential before anyone else, that you had strategically positioned yourself as his gold-digging wife, I finished for him. Richard flinched slightly at the bluntness of my words, but didn't deny them. I never fully believed that narrative. I saw how you supported him, how you cared for Sophie, how you managed your household with dignity despite Pamela's comments. But I didn't know about your professional contributions. David never shared that part of the story with us. "Did you ever ask?" I challenged gently. Richard looked away, back toward the lake. "No, and that's part of what I'm apologizing for," I assumed. I let Pamela's version of events stand unchallenged because it was simpler than asking the hard questions. A loon called out across the water, its haunting cry echoing off the surrounding hills. I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug, seeking its warmth. "Richard, I appreciate your apology. I really do. But I need to know, what happens now? Does this change anything? Or will Pamela continue to see me as the opportunist who latched onto your son at exactly the right moment?" Richard sighed heavily. "Pamela is complicated. She comes from a world where roles are clearly defined, where appearances matter above almost everything else. Finding out that the narrative she's constructed and believed for a decade is false, it's going to take time for her to adjust." "And if she doesn't?" I asked. "If she can't accept the truth?" "Then that will be her loss," Richard said, firmly, surprising me with his directness. "Because I won't sit by silently anymore. Not when I now understand what you've contributed, not just to David's success, but to this family." His words touched me more deeply than I expected. After years of feeling like an outsider in the Mitchell family, Richard's acknowledgement felt like the first genuine acceptance I'd received. "Thank you," I said quietly. Richard nodded, then changed the subject slightly. "David told me he's called a board meeting for this afternoon." "Yes, he wants to officially recognize my role as co-founder." "It's the right thing to do," Richard said, "and long overdue." He hesitated, then added, "I'd like to be there, if that's all right with you, as a show of support." I looked at him in surprise. Richard had always maintained a polite distance from David's company affairs, despite having provided some of the initial seed funding. His offer to publicly stand with me was unexpected. I'd appreciate that, I told him sincerely. The sliding door opened again, and Sophie stepped out onto the deck, still in her pajamas, her hair wild from sleep. "Mom? Grandpa?" she said, blinking in the morning light. "Is everything okay?" Richard smiled at his granddaughter, a genuine warmth in his expression that I rarely saw. "Everything's fine, Sophie. Your mom and I were just having a chat." Sophie came to stand beside my chair, leaning against me slightly. "About last night?" "Yes, about last night," I confirmed, putting my arm around her. "Grandpa was just telling me that he's going to come to Dad's board meeting today." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Good. You need allies." The adult phrasing coming from my 12-year-old daughter nearly made me smile despite the seriousness of the situation. Richard looked at Sophie with newfound respect. "You're a very brave young lady, you know that? Standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, is something many adults struggle with." Sophie shrugged, suddenly looking her age again. "I just didn't like how everyone was treating Mom. It wasn't fair." "No, it wasn't," Richard agreed softly. "And I'm sorry I didn't do more to stop it sooner." The three of us sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the lake come fully alive with the morning light. Then the sliding door opened, once more, this time revealing David, dressed and ready for the day. "There you all are," he said, joining us on the deck. "I've been looking everywhere." He glanced between his father and me, clearly trying to gauge the nature of our conversation. "Your father and I were just talking," I explained. "He's offered to come to the board meeting today." David's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Really? That would be great, Dad. Thank you." Richard stood, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "It's time this family stood together on the right side of things. Now I think we should all get ready to head back to the city. The meeting's at 2, correct?" David nodded, still looking slightly stunned by his father's support. "Then we should leave by 11. I'll go talk to your mother." Richard's tone suggested this wouldn't be an easy conversation, but he seemed prepared for it nevertheless. After Richard left, David sat in the chair his father had vacated. "What just happened?" he asked, bewildered. "I think your father just chose truth over family mythology," I said. "It's a start." Sophie, who had been leaning against the deck, railing watching the exchange, said, "Does this mean we're leaving early? What about the rest of the family vacation?" David and I exchanged glances. Neither of us had considered the implications of departing 3 days ahead of schedule. "I think, given everything that happened last night, it might be best if we head back today," David said carefully. "The board meeting is important, and we'll need some time to prepare." Sophie nodded, accepting this explanation without argument. "What about Aunt Amanda? She was nice to us." "We'll say goodbye before we leave," I promised. "And maybe we can invite her to visit us in the city sometime soon." Sophie seemed satisfied with this and wandered back inside, presumably to pack her things. When she was gone, David turned to me, his expression serious. "Becca, about today's meeting. Are you prepared for what this might mean? Going public as co-founder after all this time will raise questions. The tech blogs will run with it. Investors might get nervous." I hadn't considered the potential fallout beyond the family dynamics. David was right. There would be industry implications as well. "What exactly are you worried about?" I asked. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from our early days when he was wrestling with a difficult problem. "I'm worried that the narrative will become about why we hid your involvement for so long, that it might look like we had something to cover up, or that I deliberately took credit for your work." "Didn't you?" I challenged gently. He flinched. Not intentionally. Not at first. It just happened gradually, and then it seemed too complicated to correct." I sighed, looking out at the lake. "Then we tell the truth. The complete truth." That when we started the company, we made decisions based on the family needs at the time. That my involvement was always there but not formally recognized. That we're correcting an oversight that should have been addressed years ago. And if they ask why now? Why after 10 years? I smiled wryly. We can thank Sophie for that. Sometimes it takes a child's clarity to make adults see what's been right in front of them all along. David nodded slowly. You're right. We'll face whatever comes together. No more half-truths, no more conveniences. We spent the next hour packing our belongings, moving quietly through the lake house as the rest of the family began to stir. Amanda found me in the guest room, folding Sophie's clothes into her suitcase. You're leaving? She asked from the doorway. I nodded. David has a board meeting this afternoon in the city. We need to get back. Amanda stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Because of what happened last night. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes, David is going to formally recognize me as co-founder of Mitchell Software. Your father is coming to support us. Amanda's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Dad is? Wow, that's unexpected. He apologized to me this morning, I told her. It meant a lot. Amanda sat on the edge of the bed watching me pack. Mom's furious, you know. She's been in their room all morning, refusing to come out. I think she feels humiliated. I paused in my folding, considering this. I never wanted to humiliate her, Amanda. I just wanted to be treated with respect. I know, she said softly. And you deserve that respect. I know my mother. She doesn't handle challenges to her worldview very well. I sat beside Amanda on the bed. What do you think will happen? Amanda shrugged. Honestly, I think she'll either come around eventually, or she'll find a way to rewrite this new reality to fit her preferred narrative. Either way, things won't be the same. I'm sorry if this causes problems for you, I said sincerely. Amanda had always been the peacemaker in the family, the one who smoothed over rough edges and maintained harmony, at any cost. She shook her head. Don't be. This confrontation was long overdue, and for what it's worth, I'm proud of Sophie. She's got guts. I smiled at the mention of my daughter. She certainly does. I'm still in shock over what she did. She gets it from you, you know, Amanda said. That courage. That refusal to let injustice stand. Her words surprised me. I'd never thought of myself as particularly courageous. Patient, perhaps, resilient, but not brave. If anything, I'd been too accommodating over the years, too willing to let Pamela's narrative about me go unchallenged. I don't know about that, I admitted. I've spent 10 years trying not to rock the boat. And yet you never compromised who you are, Amanda pointed out. You never tried to become what my mother wanted you to be. That takes its own kind of courage. I hadn't considered it that way before. Despite all the subtle pressure to conform to the Mitchell family expectations, I had maintained my own identity, my own values. Perhaps there was strength in that after all. Our conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Richard, looking grave. The car will be ready in 30 minutes, he informed us. David's downstairs loading the luggage. Thanks. Dad, Amanda said, standing up. I'll help Becca finish packing. Richard nodded and retreated, leaving the door ajar. Through it, I could see Pamela at the end of the hallway watching us. Our eyes met briefly before she turned and disappeared into the master bedroom. She'll come around, Amanda said, noticing the exchange. Eventually. I wasn't so sure, but I appreciated Amanda's optimism. Either way, we'll be okay. With Amanda's help, I finished packing quickly. Sophie returned from saying goodbye to her cousins, and the three of us headed downstairs, together. David and Richard were waiting by the front door, along with Michael, who looked uncomfortable but determined. Becca, he said as we approached. Could I have a word before you go? I was surprised by the request, but nodded, stepping aside with him while Amanda took Sophie to the car. I want to apologize, Michael said stiffly once we were alone. I've never been particularly welcoming to you. I followed Mom's lead, and that was wrong of me. His apology seemed genuine, if somewhat forced. I suspected Richard might have had something to do with it. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. He cleared his throat awkwardly. Jennifer and I were talking last night, after everything. She pointed out that if anyone is a gold digger in this family, it's probably her. He attempted a small smile. Her father is a plumber, you know. Mom nearly had a heart attack when I brought her home the first time. This was news to me. Jennifer had always seemed so perfectly aligned with the Mitchell family values, so polished and suitable. I'd had no idea she came from a background similar to my own. I didn't know that, I admitted. Michael nodded. She worked hard to fit in, to be what Mom expected. I guess I never realized what that cost her until last night, watching you stand your ground. His insight surprised me. Perhaps there were more layers to the Mitchell family dynamics than I'd realized, more people feeling the pressure to conform to Pamela's expectations. You're welcome to visit us in the city sometime, I offered impulsively. You and Jennifer. Maybe without the whole family pressure cooker surrounding us. Michael looked surprised but nodded. We'd like that. Really. Our goodbyes to the rest of the family were brief and somewhat strained. Pamela made a last-minute appearance, maintaining a chilly politeness that didn't quite mask her anger. The cousins hugged Sophie with genuine affection, unaware of the adult complications swirling around them. The drive back to Philadelphia was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Sophie dozed in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional toll of the past 24 hours. David focused on the road, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand. Richard sat stoically beside Sophie, his presence a silent declaration of support. We arrived at the Mitchell Software headquarters with an hour to spare before the board meeting. The gleaming glass building in downtown Philadelphia always filled me with a mixture of pride and melancholy. Pride in what David had built, melancholy for my own unrealized professional ambitions. Are you ready for this? David asked as we stepped into the elevator that would take us to the executive floor. As ready as I'll ever be, I replied, smoothing down my blouse. I hadn't packed for a board meeting, but the simple blue button-down and black pants I'd brought to the lake house would have to do. Sophie had insisted on coming along, refusing to be left at home with a sitter. I started this, she'd said firmly. I want to see it through. Now she stood between David and me in the elevator, her small hand gripping mine tightly. The board members were already gathered in the conference room when we arrived, 5 men and 2 women, all looking curious about the emergency meeting. Their expressions registered surprise when they saw me and Sophie accompanying David, and outright shock when Richard followed us in. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, David began, taking his place at the head of the table. I've called this meeting to address a significant oversight in the company's founding narrative and formal structure. He glanced at me, drawing strength from my presence. As many of you know, I started Mitchell Software 10 years ago after leaving NextGen. What most of you don't know is that I didn't do it alone. My wife, Rebecca, was not just supportive in the traditional sense of the word. She was instrumental in creating this company. The board members exchanged glances, clearly confused by this unexpected announcement. Becca was my supervisor at NextGen, David continued. She recognized the potential in my software when others didn't. When we decided to launch independently, she developed our business plan, secured our initial funding, and created the marketing strategy that allowed us to gain traction in a crowded marketplace. He pulled out a flash drive and inserted it into the laptop connected to the room's projection system. I've compiled documentation of Becca's contributions from our archive, original business plans in her handwriting, early marketing materials she created. Emails from our first investors specifically mentioning her presentations as the reason they decided to fund us. The screen filled with images of documents, my familiar handwriting clearly visible on many of them. I felt a surge of emotion seeing these artifacts from our early days, physical evidence of my involvement that had been tucked away in storage for years. Due to family circumstances when Sophie was born, we made the mutual decision that Becca would step back from day-to-day operations, David explained. But she continued to consult on major decisions, develop our marketing strategies, and manage key client relationships. Her fingerprints are all over this company's success. One of the board members, Janet Chen, leaned forward with a frown. David, while this is all very interesting history, I'm not clear on why you've called an emergency meeting to share it. Because it's time to formally recognize Becca's role, David said firmly. I'm proposing that we retroactively acknowledge her as co-founder of Mitchell Software, with an appropriate equity adjustment to reflect this status. The room erupted in concerned murmurs. The board members exchanged alarmed glances, clearly blindsided by this proposal. This is highly irregular, said Howard Mercer, the most senior board member. Retroactively changing the founding structure of a company of this size could have serious legal and financial implications. I'm aware of that, David acknowledged, and I've consulted with our legal team about the proper way to execute this change. They've prepared documentation outlining the process. He distributed folders to each board member, containing what I assumed were the legal documents he'd had prepared overnight. I was impressed by his thoroughness. He must have been making calls and sending emails while I thought he was sleeping. I understand this comes as a surprise, David continued. But it's the right thing to do, both ethically and for the long-term health of the company. Becca's contributions deserve recognition, and our corporate narrative should reflect the truth of our founding. Richard, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. As one of the initial investors in Mitchell Software, I fully support this proposal. I've reviewed the documentation David has provided, and it's clear to me that Rebecca's role was significant and has been overlooked for too long. The weight of Richard Mitchell's endorsement was not lost on the board members. As a respected business figure in Philadelphia and an early backer of the company, his opinion carried substantial influence. Janet Chen studied me with newfound interest. Rebecca, may I ask why you haven't raised this issue before now? It's been 10 years. All eyes turned to me. It was a fair question, and one I had anticipated. I took a deep breath and answered, honestly. When we started the company, our priority was its success, not who got the credit. As it grew, and especially after our daughter was born, we made choices that seemed practical at the time. I stepped back from public-facing roles to support both the company and our family from behind the scenes. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. Over time, the narrative simplified. David became the face of Mitchell Software, the sole founder in media coverage and industry perception. Correcting that narrative seemed increasingly complicated as the years went by. But that doesn't change the reality of my contributions or my right to be recognized for them. Sophie, who had been sitting quietly beside me, suddenly spoke up. My mom taught me that the truth matters, even when it's inconvenient. That's why I showed everyone the recordings of Dad talking about how Mom helped build the company. The board members looked startled by Sophie's interjection, but her simple statement seemed to cut through the corporate concerns to the heart of the matter. Howard Mercer cleared his throat. Recordings? David nodded. Yes, voice memos from the early days of the company that my daughter discovered while working on a school project. They confirm everything I've told you today about Becca's role. Janet Chen leaned back in her chair, studying all of us thoughtfully. This is a lot to process. We'll need time to review these documents and consult with our own legal advisors. Of course, David agreed. I'm not asking for an immediate decision, but I want to be clear that this is happening. The only question is whether it happens with the board's cooperative support or whether we need to pursue other avenues. It was a subtle but clear message. One way or another, David was determined to see this through. The board could choose to work with him or against him, but he wasn't backing down. The meeting continued for another hour, with the board members asking detailed questions about the proposed equity structure, the potential market reaction, and the timeline for implementation. Throughout it all, David remained calm and resolute, answering their concerns with the same confidence he'd shown when pitching to our first investors a decade ago. By the end, no formal vote had been taken, but the mood had shifted from resistance to reluctant acceptance. It was clear that most of the board recognized the ethical imperative, even if they were concerned about the practical complications. As we left the meeting, Sophie slipped her hand into mine. "Did it work?" she whispered. I smiled down at her. "I think it did, sweetheart. It's going to take some time to work out all the details, but your dad did a great job of making our case." Richard joined us in the hallway, looking satisfied with the outcome. "Well done, both of you. The board will come around. They don't really have a choice, morally or practically." David emerged from the conference room last, having stayed behind to address a few final questions. He looked exhausted but relieved, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "They're scheduling a follow-up meeting for next week," he informed us. But Janet pulled me aside and said she's on board. With her support, the others will follow. "Thank you," I said simply, knowing that those two words couldn't possibly encompass the depth of my gratitude for his willingness to finally set things right. David shook his head. "Don't thank me for doing what I should have done years ago." He turned to Sophie with a smile. "Thank your daughter for having the courage to speak truth to power." Sophie beamed, looking both proud and slightly embarrassed by the attention. As we headed toward the elevators, I caught sight of our reflection. In the glass walls of the conference room, David, Sophie, Richard, and me, united as a family perhaps for the first time. Whatever came next, whatever challenges we faced from the board, from the industry, or from Pamela, we would face them together. The doors of Mitchell Software were opening to me at last, not as David's wife, but as the co-founder I had always been. A month had passed since the confrontation at the lake house. The emergency board meeting had led to 3 more lengthy sessions with lawyers, accountants, and PR consultants. The resulting press release had been carefully worded, describing my formal recognition as co-founder and celebrating the clarification of Mitchell Software's founding story. Business publications ran with the story, producing headlines ranging from respectful, "Mitchell Software acknowledges wife's co-founder role," to sensationalist, "Tech CEO's secret partner, wife claims credit after decade of silence." I sat in what was now my office on the executive floor of Mitchell Software headquarters, scrolling through the latest round of media coverage. The glass-walled space offered a stunning view of the Philadelphia skyline, the same view I'd once had at NextGen before giving it all up to support David's vision. There was a symmetry to it that wasn't lost on me. A soft knock on my open door made me look up. Janet Chen, the board member who had been my strongest advocate during the transition, stood in the doorway with a small potted orchid. "Housewarming. Gift," she said with a smile, placing it on the corner of my desk. Though I suppose office warming would be more accurate. "Thank you, Janet. It's beautiful." I gestured for her to take a seat in one of the chairs facing my desk. Janet had surprised me during the past month. After her initial skepticism at the emergency board meeting, she had taken the time to review not just the legal documentation, but the actual history of my contributions. She'd come to David and me afterward, apologizing for her hesitation and offering her full support moving forward. "How are you settling in?" she asked, crossing her legs and studying me with genuine interest. I glanced around the office, still, sparse but beginning to show signs of personalization. Sophie's artwork framed on one wall, family photos on a side table, marketing books lining the built-in shelves. "It's an adjustment," I admitted. Going from working part-time from home to suddenly having a C-suite title and an office with my name on the door. It's a lot to process. Janet nodded, understanding. Any pushback from the team? This had been one of my biggest concerns. How would the employees, many of whom had been with the company for years, react to my sudden elevation to leadership? Would they resent me as an interloper? Or worse, assume I'd gotten the position solely because I was married to the CEO? Some, I acknowledged, mostly unspoken. A few questioning glances in meetings, some resistance to my suggestions. But overall, it's been better than I expected. David's public support has helped, and so has Richard's. Richard had surprised everyone by taking a more active interest in the company following the revelation at the lake house. He'd attended several key meetings, making his support for my new role clear to anyone who might be inclined to question it. "And how are things at home?" Janet asked, her tone softening. "The personal side of this can't be easy to navigate." I appreciated her concern. Most people focused solely on the business implications, forgetting that behind the corporate restructuring was a marriage and family working through a seismic shift in dynamics. "We're working through it," I said honestly. "David and I have started seeing a marriage counselor. There's a lot to unpack after 10 years of me playing a role that didn't fully honor who I am or what I've contributed." Janet nodded. "And Sophie? How is she handling all of this?" I smiled at the mention of my daughter. "Sophie is thriving, actually. She's proud of what she did, of speaking up for me. Her school did a career day last week, and she told her entire class that her mom is a business genius who helps run a software company." The memory warmed me. Sophie had come home from school that day practically bouncing with excitement, recounting how her teacher had asked me to come speak to the class about women in technology. "She sounds like an extraordinary young woman," Janet said. "You've raised her well." "Thank you. She's taught me as much as I've taught her, I think." Janet stood, smoothing her skirt. "Well, I should let you get back to work. The marketing team presentation is at 2, correct?" I nodded, glancing at my calendar. "Yes, we're reviewing the rebrand concepts today." A complete corporate rebrand hadn't been my idea initially, but as we'd begun the process of acknowledging my role as co-founder, it had become clear that Mitchell Software's visual identity and messaging needed to evolve as well. The marketing team had embraced the challenge with enthusiasm, seeing it as an opportunity to refresh a brand that had remained largely unchanged for a decade. "I'll see you there," Janet said, moving toward the door. She paused, turning back, with a thoughtful expression. "You know, when David first proposed this change, I was concerned about the disruption it might cause. But watching you step into this role so naturally, it's obvious you should have been here all along." After Janet left, I returned to my computer, opening the presentation I'd be delivering in a few hours. The work itself was familiar territory for me. Marketing had always been my strength, but the context was entirely new. Instead of working in isolation at my home office, making suggestions that David might or might not implement, I was now leading the department, making final decisions, directing strategy. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Lunch? I'm free until 1:30. I smiled, typing back a quick, "Yes, my office or yours?" His response came immediately. "Neutral territory. The cafe downstairs?" I understood the suggestion. We were still figuring out how to navigate our new professional relationship alongside our personal one. The boundaries were blurry, the protocols undefined. Meeting in a neutral space helped us separate husband and wife from CEO and CMO. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the elevator, nodding to employees who greeted me with varying degrees of warmth as I passed. Most had been welcoming, if a bit confused by my sudden appearance in the executive ranks. A few, particularly those who had been with the company from its earliest days, had approached me privately to say they'd always known I was involved behind the scenes and were glad to see it acknowledged at last. David was already at a corner table when I arrived at the cafe on the ground floor of our building. He stood as I approached, an old-fashioned courtesy that always made me smile. "How's your morning been?" he asked as I sat across from him. "Productive. I've been finalizing the rebrand presentation and reviewing the quarterly marketing analytics. You?" Conference call with the Singapore team, then a meeting with Howard about the next funding round. He took a sip of his water. "Howard seems to be coming around, by the way. He actually referred to you as the marketing brain behind our success in the meeting." I raised an eyebrow. Howard Mercer had been the most resistant board member during the transition, voicing concerns about disrupting a successful formula and unnecessary complications. "That's progress," I acknowledged, though I'm more interested in his actions than his words at this point. David nodded understanding. "Fair enough. He's agreed to meet with you one-on-one next week. By the way, I think he wants to get to know you as a professional, not just as my wife." The waiter arrived to take our orders, and we fell into a comfortable conversation about work matters, upcoming projects, team dynamics, industry developments. It felt both strange and natural, this professional relationship layered over our personal one. In some ways, it reminded me of our early days at NextGen, before romance had complicated our working relationship. "Have you heard from your mother?" I asked as our meals arrived. David's expression tightened slightly. "She called this morning, actually. She's seen the press coverage." "And?" He sighed. "And she's still processing," as she put it. She asked if the press attention was worth disrupting the family for. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. So that's still her take on all this? That we've disrupted the family by telling the truth? "For now," David said carefully. "Dad's been working on her, trying to help her see things differently. Amanda, too. But you know my mother. She doesn't change her mind easily." We hadn't seen Pamela since leaving the lake house. She'd declined our invitation to Sunday dinner the previous weekend, citing a charity commitment that I strongly suspected was fabricated. David had spoken with her by phone a few times, conversations that had apparently been civil but strained. "And how are you feeling about it?" I asked, studying his face. "About your relationship with her right now?" David considered the question thoughtfully. Frustrated, sad, but also relieved in a way. "It's like I've been walking a tightrope for years, trying to keep everyone happy, never really succeeding. Now that I've finally chosen a side, the right side, it's painful, but there's also a certain freedom in it." I reached across the table to squeeze his hand, touched by his honesty. The past month hadn't been easy for him. Supporting my recognition as co-founder had meant confronting not just his family's expectations, but also his own complicity in allowing my contributions to go unacknowledged for so long. "I think your mother will come around eventually," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "She loves you, and she loves Sophie. Those relationships matter more to her than being right." David smiled wryly. "You're more optimistic about my mother's capacity for growth than I am, but I hope you're right." We finished our lunch discussing Sophie's upcoming science fair project and the weekend plans we'd made with Amanda, who had become a more regular presence in our lives since the confrontation at the lake house. As we were preparing to return to our respective offices, David's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his expression registering surprise. "It's my mother," he said, looking at me questioningly. "Take it," I encouraged. "I'll head back upstairs." He nodded gratefully, answering the call as I gathered my things. "Mom? Yes, I have a minute." I couldn't hear Pamela's side of the conversation, but I could see David's face transition from guarded to surprised to cautiously pleased. "Yes, she's right here, actually," he said, looking up at me. "We just had lunch. Do you want to?" "Okay, hold on." He covered the phone with his hand and whispered, She wants to talk to you. I felt a flutter of anxiety but nodded, taking the phone from him. Hello, Pamela. Rebecca. Her voice was stiff but not hostile. I've been reading the coverage about your new position at the company. Yes, there's been quite a bit of interest from the business press, I acknowledged neutrally. There was a profile of you in the Philadelphia Business Journal this morning. Did you see it? I hadn't actually. The past month had been so busy that I'd stopped actively tracking the media coverage, letting the PR team monitor it instead. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, I admitted. It was illuminating, Pamela said carefully. They spoke with some of your former colleagues at NextGen. One of them, a Thomas Reynolds, said you were the most strategic thinker he'd ever worked with. Thomas had been the CEO at NextGen, a mentor figure to me during my time there. I was touched that he had spoken favorably about me to the press. That's very kind of him, said, unsure where Pamela was going with this. There was a pause on the line, then Pamela continued, her voice slightly less rigid. I've been doing some thinking since the lake house, and I've realized there are aspects of your professional background that I never bothered to learn about. This was more self-awareness than I had expected from Pamela. There's a lot we don't know about each other, I acknowledged. Another pause, longer this time. I was wondering if you might be available for lunch next week, just the two of us. I blinked in surprise, catching David's questioning gaze across the table. I think I could arrange that, I said carefully. Good. Tuesday? There's a French bistro near your office. Le Jardin. Noon? Tuesday at noon works for me, I confirmed, still processing this unexpected overture. Fine, I'll make a reservation. Please don't bring Sophie or David. I think it's time you and I had a proper conversation. Just the two of us. Before I could respond, she had ended the call. I handed the phone back to David, slightly dazed. What was that about? He asked. Your mother just invited me to lunch, alone. David's eyebrows shot up. Seriously? What did she say? I recounted the brief conversation, still trying to make sense of it myself. She mentioned a profile of me in the business journal, one I haven't even seen yet. She seemed, I don't know, maybe a little impressed? Or at least interested in knowing more. That's unexpected, David said. But positive, I think. Mom doesn't reach out unless she wants to make amends in her own way. I wasn't entirely convinced, but I was willing to give Pamela the benefit of the doubt. I guess I'll find out on Tuesday. The rest of the week passed in a blur of meetings, presentations, and strategic planning sessions. The rebrand concept was unanimously approved by the board, with even Howard Mercer expressing enthusiasm for the fresh direction. The marketing team seemed energized by my leadership, particularly the younger members who appreciated my more collaborative approach. At home, David and I continued to navigate our new dynamics. Our sessions with the marriage counselor had been challenging but productive, forcing us to confront patterns we'd fallen into over the years. My tendency to downplay my needs for the sake of harmony, his habit of compartmentalizing his family and professional lives rather than addressing conflicts directly. Sophie watched it all with keen interest, occasionally offering insights that startled us with their perceptiveness. You both seem more like yourselves now, she observed one evening as we prepared dinner together. Like you're not pretending anymore. Tuesday arrived with a mix of trepidation and curiosity. I chose my outfit carefully, a tailored navy suit that projected confidence without ostentation, accessorized with simple pearl earrings that had been a gift from my own mother years ago. Le Jardin was an elegant bistro frequented by Philadelphia's business elite, the kind of place where deals were made over foie gras and champagne. I arrived a few minutes early, giving my name to the maitre d', who informed me that Mrs. Mitchell had already been seated. Pamela was at a corner table, perfectly coiffed and dressed in a cream-colored ensemble that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She looked up as I approached, her expression unreadable, but her posture notably less rigid than usual. "Rebecca," she said, rising slightly as I reached the table. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation," I replied, taking the seat across from her. A waiter appeared immediately to take our drink orders, sparkling water for me, a glass of Sancerre for Pamela. When he departed, an awkward silence fell between us. "I ordered a booth for privacy," Pamela said finally. "What I have to say isn't for public consumption." My guard went up instantly. Was this some kind of ambush? Had she invited me here to deliver an ultimatum or issue a threat? "I owe you an apology," she continued, surprising me so thoroughly that I nearly knocked over my water glass. "I've treated you unfairly for many years, and it's time I acknowledged that." I stared at her, searching for signs of insincerity or manipulation, but finding none. Pamela Mitchell looked genuinely uncomfortable, a state I'd never witnessed in her before. "The article in the Business Journal," she went on when I didn't immediately respond, "and several others I've read since. They've made it clear that you were accomplished in your own right before you ever met David. That you had a successful career, a reputation for excellence." She took a sip of her wine, gathering her thoughts. "I made assumptions about you from the beginning, about your background, your intentions, your capabilities. Those assumptions were unfair and, as it turns out, entirely incorrect. I found my voice at last." "Yes, they were." Pamela nodded, accepting my blunt response without defensiveness. "When Sophie played that recording at dinner, hearing David's voice from years ago, his clear acknowledgement of your contributions, it forced me to confront the narrative I'd constructed about you. A narrative that was more about my own insecurities than about who you actually are." This level of self-awareness from Pamela was so unexpected that I didn't quite know how to respond. The waiter's return with our menus gave me a moment to collect my thoughts. We ordered a niçoise salad for me, coq au vin for Pamela, and then turned back to our conversation. "What insecurities?" I asked, genuinely curious. Pamela looked momentarily startled by the direct question but composed herself quickly. "I gave up a promising career when I married Richard," she said, echoing what Amanda had told me at the lake house. "It was expected at the time. Women of my generation and social circle didn't continue working after marriage, especially once. Children came along." She traced the stem of her wine glass with one manicured finger. "I don't regret the choice. I raised 3 wonderful children, supported Richard's career, built a life I'm proud of. But there have been moments of wondering what might have been if I'd made different choices. And seeing me make similar choices triggered something in you," I suggested. Pamela nodded. "But that's just it. Your choices weren't similar at all, were they? You didn't give up your career to become a society wife. You redirected your talents to support a joint venture with your husband. You remained professionally engaged, just not in the traditional corporate structure." Her insight surprised me. It was precisely how I had viewed my choices, though I had begun to doubt that perspective as the years passed and my contributions remained unacknowledged. "That's how it was supposed to be," I acknowledged. "But somewhere along the way, the narrative changed. I became just David's wife, the mother of his child, not his business partner or professional equal." "And I contributed to that narrative," Pamela said, meeting my gaze directly. "I perpetuated it, reinforced it, because it fit my worldview. For that, I am truly sorry." The apology was delivered simply but sincerely. No qualifications, no excuses, just a straightforward acknowledgement of harm done. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot to me." Our food arrived, providing a natural pause in the conversation. We ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Pamela spoke again. Richard tells me you're making quite an impression at the company. The rebrand concept has been well received. It has, I confirmed. We're launching the new identity next quarter, with a complete overhaul of our digital presence and marketing materials. And the board? How are they adjusting to your presence? Most have been supportive, I said. Janet Chen in particular has been a strong ally. Howard Mercer was skeptical at first, but seems to be coming around. Pamela nodded, unsurprised. Howard is old school, set in his ways, but he respects competence above all else. Once he sees what you bring to the table, he'll be firmly in your corner. The confidence with which she made this prediction reminded me that whatever her faults, Pamela was deeply familiar with the business world and its power dynamics. She might have given up her own career, but she had been Richard's partner in navigating Philadelphia's corporate landscape for decades. I hope you're right, I said. I usually am, she replied with a hint of her old imperious manner, then caught herself and smiled self-deprecatingly. About business matters, at least. About people. Well, I'm trying to do better. As we finished our meal, the conversation turned to more neutral topics. Sophie's academic achievements, Amanda's recent promotion at her architecture firm, a charity gala Pamela was helping to organize. It wasn't exactly warm, but it was the most genuine interaction we'd ever had. When the check arrived, Pamela reached for it immediately. My invitation, my treat, she said firmly. I didn't argue, recognizing the gesture for what it was. Not just financial courtesy, but a small acknowledgement of her desire to make amends. As we prepared to leave, Pamela hesitated, then spoke. Rebecca, I want you to know. I don't expect things between us to transform overnight. What I said to you over the years, how I treated you. It can't be erased with one lunch and an apology. No, it can't, I agreed. But I would like the opportunity to get to know you, the real you, not the version I constructed in my mind. And perhaps over time, to develop a relationship based on mutual respect rather than the dynamic we've had until now. Her candor was refreshing. No pretense that all was forgiven, no expectation of immediate reconciliation, just an honest acknowledgement of where we were and a genuine desire to move forward differently. I'd like that too, I said, surprised to find that I meant it. We walked together to the exit, an awkward moment arising as we reached the sidewalk. Were we at the hugging stage? A handshake seemed too formal, but our usual cool nods too distant after the conversation we'd just had. Pamela solved the dilemma by briefly touching my arm. Thank you for meeting me today, Rebecca. I'll be in touch about Sunday dinner. Perhaps you, David, and Sophie could join us this weekend? We'd like that, I said, thinking of how pleased Sophie would be to visit her grandparents' home again. As I watched Pamela walk toward the parking garage, her posture straight and elegant as always, I felt a lightness I hadn't expected. Our relationship would never be effortless, never free of the history that had shaped it. But there was now a possibility for something new to grow in the space cleared by honesty. I checked my watch. There was still time before my next meeting. On impulse, I called David. How did it go? He asked immediately. Surprisingly well, I told him, recounting the conversation as I walked back toward the office. She apologized, David, actually apologized, and meant it. His silence told me how significant this was. Pamela Mitchell rarely admitted fault, and never without qualifications or deflections. Wow, I didn't see that coming. Neither did I admitted, but it felt like a genuine olive branch. She invited us for Sunday dinner this weekend. Do you want to go? He asked carefully. I considered the question, appreciating that he was prioritizing my comfort rather than automatically accepting. Yes, I think I do. It won't fix everything. Overnight, but it's a start. Then we'll go, he said simply. I ended the call as I reached the Mitchell Software building, pausing to look up at the gleaming glass tower. 6 weeks ago, I had entered this building as David's wife, here for a lunch date or to drop off something he'd forgotten at home. Now I walked through those doors as Rebecca Mitchell, co-founder and chief marketing officer, recognized not just for my connection to David, but for my own contributions and capabilities. The journey wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, both professional and personal. Some employees would continue to question my sudden elevation. Some industry colleagues would whisper about nepotism. Some family members might never fully accept the new reality. But for the first time in years, I was walking my own path rather than carefully following someone else's. As I rode the elevator to the executive floor, I thought about Sophie and the extraordinary courage she had shown that night at the lake house. My quiet, observant daughter had seen what the adults around her had been unwilling to acknowledge. That truth matters, that contributions should be recognized, that silence in the face of injustice only perpetuates it. She had taught me to speak up, to claim my rightful place, to demand recognition not just for my own sake, but for hers as well. Because of her bravery, she would grow up seeing her mother acknowledged as a professional in her own right, respected, for her contributions rather than defined solely by her relationship to others. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where my name now appeared on the directory alongside David's and the other C-suite officers. As I walked toward my office, employees nodded respectfully, no longer surprised by my presence, in these hallways. I had arrived, not as someone's wife, not as a gold digger who had latched onto a promising prospect, but as myself. Rebecca Mitchell, accomplished in my own right, finally claiming the recognition I had earned. It had taken a child's courage to break the silence, but now that it was broken, my voice had emerged stronger than ever. And this time, I would make sure it was heard. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.